Today's material explores the roots of industrial capitalism, basically tracing it from Dutch agriculture all the way to British factories and the really harsh realities of 19th century labor.
Yeah.
And it is incredibly strong, so we're just going to skip the basic structural praise and dive right into the high-level editorial feedback.
Let's do it.
So, as I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that the Dutch agricultural innovations, like planting that nitrogen-rich clover, basically spurred this massive British population boom.
Right.
But the material presents this shift almost like, a gentle stream naturally flowing into a new valley.
Mm-hmm.
But wasn't this actually more like a dam breaking? Like violently forcing people out of their homes?
The narrative leap from Dutch agricultural techniques to the British factory system misses a crucial opportunity to explore the human friction of displacement.
Okay.
Because right now, if we just read the current draft as it stands, the introduction of crop rotation and, feeding livestock year-round, it feels like this isolated victory for human ingenuity.
Yeah, like it's just pure scientific progress.
Exactly. The text walks us through how food prices drop, disposable income rises, and the overall population gets healthier.
Right.
It reads almost like this rosy agronomic success story, right out of a farming almanac.
I was actually struck by that tone as well. I mean, it frames the agricultural revolution as this purely benevolent advancement.
Yeah, and the weakness with framing it as this standalone triumph is that it glosses over the exact mechanics of how crop rotation directly fueled the enclosure movement.
Ah, right.
It accidentally softens the blow of early capitalism because the text treats the enclosure acts, where those wealthy landlords basically fenced off the common lands, as a separate sort of unfortunate footnote.
Right. It just happens to occur a few pages later in the draft.
Exactly. So my suggestion here is to restructure the flow to explicitly bridge those agronomic innovations with the enclosure acts as a singular, ruthless chain of cause and effect.
Okay, I like that.
It's not enough to say, well, the Dutch figured out how to use clover to restore nitrogen, and then, later on, the British government started fencing off grazing areas.
They need to be linked.
Right. The privatization of land needs to be positioned as the primary catalyst for the mass urbanization that actually birthed the factory working class.
Wait, let me make sure I follow the historical logic we want the writer to emphasize here.
Sure.
Are we saying the clover itself caused the displacement, or was it, like, the landowning class seeing the dollar signs from the clover that caused it?
Oh, it is absolutely the latter.
Because right now, the text implies that better, more efficient farming just naturally led to fewer farmers being needed, which feels like just a passive demographic shift.
Right. And that is the exact distinction the text needs to make clear. Better farming didn't just passively reduce the need for labor.
Right.
British landlords actively observed the massive yield increases from these Dutch methods. I mean, before this, land had to be left fallow to recover, right?
Yeah, they had to rotate it out.
But now, with clover and turnips, the land could be highly productive year-round. So the landlords realized that if they could monopolize the land, they could keep all those newly multiplied profits for themselves.
Wow. So it was entirely deliberate?
Exactly. The enclosure movement wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate legal mechanism to steal the commons from the peasantry.
Just so the aristocracy could run massive, highly profitable agricultural enterprises.
You got it. So the issue is that the writer separates these two events historically and structurally.
Okay, I see.
So for a concrete example, instead of treating them as distinct chapters, the writer should intertwine them on the page.
Like show the immediate consequence.
Yeah. They could explicitly detail how a landlord sees that nitrogen-rich clover working on a small scale and realizes, wow, this vast common land could be astronomically profitable if enclosed.
Right, and then they deliberately use Parliament to pass enclosure acts, just completely cutting the tenant farmers out of the equation.
That is a perfect way to visualize it for the reader. Like, don't let the clover be a standalone success story.
Yeah. Show the reader that the landlords literally weaponized this agronomic innovation to create a desperate landless labor pool.
Yes, they cleared those fields on purpose. If I were revising this, I would write a sequence showing the peasant farmer being, thrilled by the larger crop yield one season,
Oh, that's good.
only to find a fence built around his ancestral grazing land the next.
Driven entirely by the landlord's desire to scale that exact yield.
Exactly. The text needs to capture that deliberate economic strategy.
Because if you don't connect the clover to the fence, you lose the origin story of the industrial worker.
Precisely.
And I mean, once those landlords cleared the land, those displaced people didn't just vanish into thin air.
No, they had to go somewhere.
Right, which meant they flooded the cities, looking for literally any possible way to survive.
Yeah.
And that sudden massive influx of desperate people naturally leads us to the next section.
The factory floor.
Exactly. Let's look closely at the section discussing the rapid drop in the agricultural workforce from, what was it, 80% to 25%?
Yeah, 80 down to 25.
Which is huge. But the material lists child labor and low wages as these downsides of the era. And I'm thinking, shouldn't we interrogate why the capitalists were able to get away with this, rather than just stating that they did?
The portrayal of 19th century working conditions relies too heavily on broad historical tropes, without grounding the suffering in the specific economic mechanisms of supply and demand we just established.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, the weakness is that the text lists long hours, low wages, miserable conditions, and child labor as the sudden, almost inevitable downsides to the era of mechanized capital investment.
Right. The writer calls it the era of the stand machine, which is a really clever analogy for mechanized capital, by the way.
It's a great analogy, but a reader looking at that list of miseries might just think, well, times were tough back then, and factory owners were just exceptionally cruel.
Right. It treats the miserable conditions as a moral failure of the 19th century.
Exactly. But we just established this massive artificial labor surplus generated by the enclosure movement.
Yeah, all those displaced farmers.
So my suggestion here is to focus the discussion of factory conditions specifically on the concept of labor supply.
Okay.
The text needs to demonstrate how the sheer volume of displaced workers entirely stripped the labor force of its bargaining power.
Making those horrific conditions an economic strategy, rather than just, like, cruelty.
Right. We want to make the case that it was leveraging a flooded market rather than just general Victorian-era cruelty or lack of labor regulations.
So I'm trying to think of how the writer can practically apply this to the data they already have in the draft.
The demographic data is perfect for this.
Yeah, because they mentioned earlier that in 1520, 80% of the English population worked the land.
Mm-hmm.
But by 1850, that percentage had plummeted to 25. That is a staggering shift.
It really is.
But right now, it just sits there as a standalone statistic in a paragraph about demographics. It's completely divorced from the paragraph about the factory conditions.
And that data point is the exact lever the writer needs to pull. For a concrete example, when the material states that the agricultural workforce dropped to 25%, it shouldn't just move on.
Right. Don't just leave it hanging.
It should immediately follow up by explaining how this exact flood of unemployed citizens, that 55% of the population suddenly displaced, pouring into the cities, allowed capitalists to enforce starvation wages.
Wow.
The massive drop in rural labor is the direct cause of the miserable urban conditions.
So the fix is to close the gap between the demographic data and the realities of the factory floor.
Yes.
I mean, if a textile mill owner knows there are 100 starving ex-farmers standing in the mud outside the factory gate,
Willing to work for absolutely anything.
willing to work for pennies just to eat that day, the owner has absolutely no incentive to install safety equipment or shorten the workday or raise wages.
The cruelty is economically incentivized.
Exactly.
And take child labor as another example.
Okay.
The text currently frames children working in coal mines and textile mills as a deeply tragic reality of the era, which, it was.
Right, obviously.
But if we apply this labor supply lens, child labor becomes a direct economic consequence of adult wages being driven so incredibly low by the labor surplus.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to frame it. The father's wage was mathematically driven into the ground by the oversupply of labor.
Exactly.
Which forced entire families to send their 5- and 6-year-old children into the factories just to afford enough bread to survive the week.
Right, so instead of just listing child labor as a bullet point of misery, the writer should frame it as a necessary survival mechanism for the working class.
Created entirely by the capitalist exploitation of the labor pool.
Yes, the child isn't in the factory just because the owner lacks a moral compass.
Right?
The child is there because the entire system was engineered to exploit that initial displacement from the farmland.
Man, it connects the dots perfectly.
It elevates the text from a simple recount of, like, bad things that happened to a razor-sharp economic analysis of exactly how the system was built to extract labor.
A fully functioning ecosystem.
A dark one, yeah, but here is where the narrative hits a fascinating wall for me, and I want to transition to this.
Okay.
We've got a system engineered to pay these displaced workers absolute subsistence wages, just enough to keep them alive and operating the machines.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, at the exact same time, the text dives into the cultural revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries.
Right, the mercantilists.
Yeah. So a key theme running through this material seems to be these writers like Thomas Munn and John Carey, who argued that individuals were rational actors and, crucially, consumers.
Right.
They're talking about this, quote, exorbitant appetite for manufactured goods driving industry.
Yeah.
But wait, we just established that these workers were living in abject poverty with virtually no disposable income. So how could they simultaneously be the driving force of this new consumer appetite?
The exploration of Britain's cultural shift toward consumerism overlooks the darker psychological and economic paradox of demanding mass consumption from an actively impoverished working class.
Right, it's a massive contradiction.
It is. The weakness here is that the text introduces this radical idea that men and women were suddenly viewed as consumers to spur economic growth, but it completely fails to interrogate the glaring contradiction of this expectation.
When you set it against the abject poverty of those 19th century workers we just talked about.
Exactly.
Because it feels like a massive blind spot in the current draft. On one hand, capitalism absolutely needs consumers to buy the goods the factories are churning out.
Right. If no one buys the textiles, the factory goes bankrupt.
But on the other hand, the factory owners are simultaneously doing everything in their power to pay the very people making those goods as little as humanly possible.
Yes.
I mean, you can't consume if you are starving. You don't have an exorbitant appetite for manufactured goods if you are spending 90% of your wage on bread and rent.
Exactly. So my suggestion is to elevate the historical states by explicitly analyzing this exact contradiction on the page.
Okay.
The text needs to explore how industrial capitalism required a robust consumer base, while its own relentless drive for cheap labor actively undermined the creation of that base.
Right.
Right now, the material just sets the consumer expectation right alongside the subsistence wages, without pointing out the fundamental friction between the two.
So how do we want the writer to visualize this friction? Because the text relies heavily on that John Carey quote from 1695.
The one about the appetite of men?
Yeah, where he says the main spur to trade is the exorbitant appetite of men, which they will take pain to gratify.
Right.
And the writer calls him a cheerleader for capitalism. So should they reconsider how they frame Collery, or maybe challenge his premise more directly?
Well, as a concrete example, I wouldn't necessarily reconsider the framing of Collery himself,
Okay.
because he accurately represents the mercantilist mindset of the era. But rather, look at how his quote interacts with the rest of the text.
Ah, I see.
The writer should frame John Collery's quote about the appetite of men directly against the reality of the starving factory workers we discussed earlier.
Oh, put him in the same room, basically.
Exactly. Put them in the same paragraph or section.
So create a direct juxtaposition. Have Collery cheering for the consumer's exorbitant appetite, and then, in the very next sentence, describe a family of displaced farmers working 14-hour days just to afford gruel.
Yes, let the reader feel the whiplash between the rosy philosophical theory of the early capitalists and the muddy, desperate reality of the working class.
Oh, that's powerful.
When you put those two concepts right next to each other, the paradox becomes undeniable. The system demands that people buy things, but refuses to pay them enough to buy anything.
That's a fantastic editorial trick.
Right?
Because by highlighting that paradox, the writer can then seamlessly transition into how this inherent tension eventually became the exact pressure cooker that necessitated the labor union movements.
Yes, and the socialist critiques mentioned later in the text, like Blanqui and Marx.
Right. And that is crucial for the final act of the piece. When Marx argues that capitalism replaces egalitarian collaboration with conflict.
It shouldn't feel like he's just reacting to bad working conditions.
Exactly. It shouldn't feel like he's just writing from a place of moral outrage.
Right. The text should show that Marx and others were analyzing this exact mathematical paradox in the capitalist blueprint.
The absolute necessity for mass consumption colliding violently with the absolute necessity for poverty wages.
They were pointing out that the engine was fundamentally designed to tear itself apart.
Wow, that naturally ties the philosophical end of the piece right back into the gritty economic mechanics we started with.
It brings it all full circle.
The whole narrative just becomes this tight, unbreakable chain of cause and effect.
Yeah.
So just to recap the ground we've covered in this critique today, we started by looking at bridging the gap between Dutch agricultural innovations and the Enclosure Act.
Right.
We want the text to ensure that land privatization is treated as a deliberate weapon used by landlords to create a desperate labor pool.
Exactly. Not just letting the Clover be a standalone success story and enclosure an unrelated footnote.
Right. And then we also looked at leveraging the demographic data, specifically that massive drop in the agricultural workforce from 80% to 25%. The goal there is to explain the horrific factory conditions entirely through the lens of labor supply.
Stripping away the assumption that it was just general 19th century cruelty.
Yeah, showing how the oversupply of workers drove wages down so far that child labor literally became a mathematical necessity for survival.
Perfect.
And finally, we discussed leaning into the inherent paradox of early consumer culture.
The whiplash.
Right. By explicitly juxtaposing the philosophical demand for an exorbitant appetite against a factory system designed to enforce starvation wages, the text can perfectly set the stage for the socialist critiques and labor movements that followed.
It's all about making those connections explicit.
Exactly. So we highly encourage the writer to implement these revisions, tighten those causal links, and submit the work back to the critique for another round of feedback.
We'd love to see it.
Because the origins of this system were not a clean machine operating in a vacuum. The engine of industrial capitalism wasn't just built from steel and blueprints. It was built on a foundation of forced displacement, functioning exactly the way it was designed to.